So now that we've talked a little bit about the difference between disguised and undisguised participant observation, let's talk about some of the benefits of participant observation. So because you are temporarily joining up with this group, you're actually studying behavior with that group's insider point of view. And this gives you a better opportunity to understand the behavior within a certain social context and understand the meaning of that behavior. And in some cases, like we saw with the doomsday cult, it may potentially be the only way to obtain that access. But some of the negatives is that because, especially if this is undisguised, you are having a greater risk of influencing group behavior. So unlike naturalistic observation, which requires total passivity, participant observation actually it requires you to participate and interact with group members, whether that's disguised or not. And because you're more actively involved, there is a greater likelihood that you, the observer, are changing group members' behaviors in some way. Additionally, because you are joining up with this group, it's possible that you could lose an appropriate sense of boundaries between researcher and group members as well. So now we're going to finally talk about structured observation. So structured observation, sometimes this can occur in a laboratory. It can also occur in an observational setting that has been specified by the researcher. And that can either be done in part or in full. And participants may take part in certain tasks or certain types of social situations and observe what happens. Probably one of the best known examples of this in social psychology is Sherif's robber's cave experiment. I'm going to show you a video that gives you the basic outline of the details of the experiment, but this experiment was designed to be a structured observation that looks at when groups are more likely to cooperate with each other and like each other versus situations where they have to compete with each other for scarce resources. And we often tend to find that competition for scarce resources often will foster intergroup conflict. So let's hear a little bit more about this experiment.
Have done it. So all the boys had to work together to figure out this problem and resolve the problem. There were many such similar team-building activities between both groups, and at the end of the third stage, what they found was that the boys liked each other much more because of these team-building activities. At first, there was very strong in-group bias, where the team members just associated with other team members. But after these team-building events where the groups actually got together to solve a common problem, they found out that they really liked each other a lot more than before. This whole experiment was a confirmation of Sherif's realistic conflict theory, which states that when there's competition for resources, negative feelings will arise. Now, over 50 years have passed since this first experiment. And what modern theories tell us is that A, this theory is correct, and B, one of the best ways to reduce this kind of outgroup bias and this prejudice and discrimination we have for other groups is to socialize with the other groups, is to work towards a common cause.
So that's pretty good. That's a pretty good overview of a structured observation. Yes, I realize I misspelled Sherif's last name. And ideally, structured observations like these are designed to function as an analog of natural circumstances as much as possible. However, because the researcher has partially or fully structured the setting, there is a bit more control over these experiences than if you were doing participant observation or a naturalistic observation. So here are the positives of structured observation. One of the first things we'll find is that there is greater efficiency. As we kind of saw in the robber's cave experiment, everybody is being exposed to the same circumstances. Everybody's being exposed to the same things. So we do find that behaviors should occur at very similar times. And as I mentioned, there is also greater research control. Everybody's going to be in the exact same setting with the exact same external conditions. But here are the negatives. The question is, as you start, and I've kind of mentioned this before throughout the semester, the more control that you exert over the research setting, the less it looks like what you would experience in everyday life. And so the question is this analog an exact match of what would happen in real life? Hopefully it's pretty close, but if it's not, this may not necessarily be a good predictor of what behavior would look like if we saw it out in the real world. Additionally, nobody here is disguised. People know that they're potentially being watched, and so there is a greater chance of reactivity as a result. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how we record different types of observations. So we're going to look at the difference between a narrative record and a field note. So normally I would explain the difference between a narrative record and a field note and have you try that yourself. Obviously, under current circumstances, that's going to be a little bit difficult. If we are doing something called a narrative record, you are doing an ongoing description of behavior that is being used for later analysis. This description is incredibly extensive, it's very continuous, and you write it as soon as you see the behavior. So it's basically writing down the entire narrative of what is going on. Now, field notes in comparison are typically not as extensive. They are typically written after observing behavior compared to narrative records, which are often done while the behavior is occurring. And additionally, because they're written later, we're only going to focus on the most important aspects of behavior. So I can't really do this for you in class because, well, we're not in class, but I can try with a slightly different example. So let's say, for example, I am in my room recording my lecture with my cat. I am actually doing that, by the way. Now, if I were doing a narrative record of everything that my cat is doing right now, my cat is sitting to the left of me. He is kind of looking at me. He's purring and breathing kind of heavily. His tail is wagging about 5 times, and now he is kind of leaning back into my hand as I pet his back. So a narrative record, I would be writing down every single thing that I saw my cat do. On the other hand, if I was doing something like a field note, I'd say, my cat's laying down next to me and he kind of likes it when I pet him and he moved against me as I pet him. So you can kind of see that the narrative record is typically going to be a lot more detailed, but it's also going to include a lot of trivial details that may not be very important later on. On the other hand, field notes are only looking at the important instances of behavior, but they're not necessarily looking for those more subtle details. Now, what do we use narrative records and field notes for? You can actually use these for either a quantitative or a qualitative analysis of your data. So you can code the data to examine whether there are larger themes or patterns in the behaviors that we see, so that would be qualitative. Or you can code data numerically. You can look at the number of instances of behavior for a statistical quantitative analysis. So now let's really get into the meat of how to make a good observational study. Your observational data is really only going to be as good as your coding system. So we're going to talk a little bit about how you can code behavior in a way that ensures that your data are good. And you want to have your coding system specified ahead of time before you ever collect data. Additionally, if you're training other people to collect data in your observational study, they need to be trained and very familiar with your coding system. So, behavioral coding systems basically occur when we classify participant responses or behaviors into mutually exclusive categories. This is really important. If we want to be able to code data and make sure that it's clear, we need to make sure that a behavior either goes into one type of category or another type of category. It cannot go into multiple categories. So a pretty famous example from 1977 that looked at this was looking at Little League coaches and how they treated their players who were children. And part of the reason that this study was made was that during the 1970s, organized youth sports like Little League and soccer were starting to become a lot more popular. Odds are pretty good growing up that you were in some kind of a youth sport. I thankfully am not the athletic type and I did Girl Scouts and dance. Sometimes I kind of wish I'd done some youth sports though. But one of the things that's really important to know about youth sports, especially when participation in these programs started to skyrocket, is that the coaches are often parents. And the parents don't typically have training with respect to coaching or physical education. And so that's a potential issue. And so some researchers wanted to know, what does competing in these youth sports do for kids? What are the effects of competition on kids, and how do coaches treat them? And so I'm not really going to look at the findings from Smith's study. What we're largely going to look at is the coding system that they developed for different Little League coaches. Now, as you can kind of see, this is pretty extensive. And notice too that the way that these different categories are defined, they are mutually exclusive. So we have responses to desirable performance and responses to mistakes. So responses to desirable performance include reinforcement, defined as a positive response. Hey, way to go there, good eye. Non-reinforcement is basically a failure to respond. Note that this is mutually exclusive. You cannot respond and fail to respond at the same time. So this is a really smart coding system. And then we have our different responses to mistakes. We have encouragement, a positive consoling reaction. Hey, that's okay. You'll get them next time. We have technical instruction, instructing how to correct a mistake. Don't swing until the ball is closer to you. We have punishment, a negative reaction. Hey, what was that? That was terrible. We have punitive technical instruction, which is basically technical instruction, but it's harsh or sarcastic. And then ignoring the mistake. Again, all of these are mutually exclusive categories. And so the idea is that somebody who has this coding system can go out, watch a Little League game, and note the different instances of these different types of behaviors. So during the game, the observer would mark the different behaviors in those categories on a behavior checklist, which is basically a list of these different categories. So as you see a behavior, mark off instances when you see it. So we get a count of how many different behaviors that you actually saw. Some other ways that we can record observations include things like rating scales, ranking scales, and diaries. So there are a lot of other ways to evaluate behavior besides coming up with a coding system. We can do things like rating or ranking scales. We can evaluate behavior or other characteristics. That might include things like peer nominations. So some observational researchers look at effects of popularity or effects of unpopularity on kids at school. One of the ways that they can actually measure popularity is by sending out a peer nomination. Name the 3 kids that you would most like to be friends with. And that's how they can kind of get that observational index. That can include recommendations. Another way that we can actually evaluate behavior is with diaries. Now, this is a little bit more important because this requires self-observation. So this is when behaviors or experiences are recorded by the participant for a defined period of time or whenever certain events take place. So, a really cool example of a diary study was one that was actually done by Mike Kane back in 2007 with colleagues, looking at what they refer to as TUTs, or task unrelated thoughts. A lot of research that Kane has done has found that that people with lower working memory capacity, so people who can't control their attention as well, they can hold fewer items in mind, tend to be more prone to mind wandering and task unrelated thoughts. And so one of the ways that he's actually been able to look at that, at least back in 2007, was give people PDAs, so personalized digital assistants, that would go off at random times and give participants a little survey about their current mental state, whether their thinking was on task, whether they were off task, whether they were engaging in mind wandering at that point. And so that's one potential way that you can actually utilize diaries for that information. Now, here's what's really critical. You have to be using other types of methods besides a diary itself. Kane certainly did. If the diary is the sole method of obtaining your data, it is not an observational study. It is what we would call a diary study. So now let's briefly talk about how we sample data in observational research. And this is something that you absolutely have to do. If you are watching multiple people, you cannot observe every person, and you cannot observe every possible behavior that you see. Your attention is too limited for that. So what you're going to have to do instead is engage in a process known as sampling. And there are 4 different types that you can use. First, you can do what's called a focal sample. So you make one person the focus of your observation. So you select a person to be observed at a given time, and then later on you can shift your attention to another person. You can do what's called a scan sample. At a pre-selected time, you rapidly scan each member of the group and look at their behavior. Now, I would say if you're planning on doing this, make sure that you have a small number of categories. If you have 17 different behaviors that you're looking for, you are not going to be able to mark them all with a rapid scan like this. We can do situation sampling, where we observe behavior across different types of settings. So I might look at seating patterns at Rainy Dining Hall. I might look at seating patterns at a mall food court. So I can look at behavior across different settings, and I can do time sampling. I can select a representative set of time periods where observation will occur. So if I want to see people's toilet paper buying behavior at the grocery store, I can look at different periods of time. I can look in the morning when the trucks are restocking toilet paper. I can look at rush hour, and I can look at noon and see if there are differences over time. So I'm going to stop here. We will discuss some issues with observational research and finish up in the next lecture.